Great. Well, welcome all. Thank you for coming today to this month's edition of What's Your Plan? So each month, Assisting Hands Home Care sponsors a talk. My name is Steve Lorberbaum. I'm the owner of Assisting Hands. And what we try to do is speak to some industry expert or some life or aging expert, someone who can help us kind of think about how we age, how we age in place, and maybe resources to help us do that and do that better and easier and safer. And so, what Assisting Hands does is we're a private duty home care company. We work with families to provide aids in their homes to reduce the stress on family members by being there when they can't be. So we work all over Montgomery County, PG County, and Fairfax County, Virginia. And we work to try to, carefully select an aide who would be a good person to be in someone's home and help them, whether it's recovering from surgery or it's living with a cognitive or physical impairment. So this week, I'm really excited to have Reverend Rebecca Savage with us because as I said briefly before you all joined, my wife is a yoga instructor and she is the spiritual side of our family. I was an engineer and a lawyer, so I am the more practical side. So I have a lot of questions for Rebecca and something I'm really excited about. So Rebecca, I'll give you a minute. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
Good morning, Steve. Good morning, Patricia. Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Fantastic. My name is Reverend Dr. Rebecca Savage. I am the senior called minister of the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Rockville, of which a few of the members of that wonderful congregation are actually here with us today. And for accessibility, we often will try and describe ourselves. I am wearing a black shirt, I have black framed glasses on, and I have elbow length hair that's sort of curly. And I'm in my home, so you can imagine there's roses and wallpaper behind me. I was raised a Unitarian Universalist in Bethesda, Maryland at the River Road UU congregation. And I went to college in Minnesota and I went to seminary in New York City, and then I commissioned in the Army as a military chaplain. So after I was ordained, I served in the Army on active duty, and I am a combat veteran. I served a tour in Afghanistan, and I'm coming up on my 20-year anniversary of ordination, and I'm currently inactive in the military because I was doing other things and serving an amazing congregation. So I come from a very liberal, progressive denomination, Unitarian Universalist, and may I say a bit more, Steve? Do you mind, or do
Yeah,
you want to
please go
launch
right
into the
ahead.
question? Okay. Because what I was thinking about this morning is what makes my ministry particularly invested in the aging and the dying process. And I realized one of the early experiences that I had was as not just only a combat chaplain, but as a hospital trauma chaplain. And so I've been around people who are in the last phases of their life ever since I was ordained in my formation process. And as a military chaplain, infused in the culture is memory, is honoring death, honoring the transitions of life very intentionally. And so as a minister in a multi-generational congregation now, that is one of the things that I feel is really important, is how we honor that process and how we remember our beloveds after they die.
Great. So I'll jump into some questions, and you'll feel free to steer off them if you've got other things you want to sort of focus on. But one of the things that I always think about is in America, we're very uncomfortable talking about death and aging. And so I think it's very important, though, for older adult children to be able to have that conversation with their parents so they know what people want. Can you give us some ideas, some tips on how do you broach that conversation that no one wants to have?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. It's a very live conversation in my congregation. A few years ago, we brought out the book The Other Talk, which I think is exactly what you're talking about. It gives some tips and resources about how to have those conversations. And we're starting a workshop series on end of life conversations for those in the sandwich generation. Like myself, I'm caring for older parents or an older parent now and children at the same time. How do we I think it's easy often to raise the conversation. It's harder to stay in the conversation because sometimes the response is, why do we have to talk about this? That let's be more positive. That's how could you be so dark? And it's not a matter of being morbid or being pessimistic. It's actually the most loving thing families can do, because I've seen the alternate when there are no wishes, when there are no conversations, and families are thrown into chaos and strife and conflict because they don't know. They don't know what that person would have wanted, has expressed wishes, there hasn't been conversation, there is no living will, there are no end of life requests. So I encourage families along the lines of, this is the most loving and compassionate thing you can do as a family, is to have these conversations and try and be a little, I'm highly pragmatic as well, being a little pragmatic of, let's get some of the details down. We would like to honor your wishes.
I even think so. For me, my mom passed away from cancer many years ago, and she was up in New York. I didn't know how sick she was, and she and my dad never told us. Had I known, I would have gone up and visited more. I would have spent more time with her. And so I didn't know, and I feel like that failure to communicate in this time really made a difference, in that I didn't know enough. I was in my world of caring for my family, my business, and I just didn't know. So I do think you're right. It's important to sort of have that conversation, to give people an opportunity to visit with one another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, all right. So, aside from sort of aging, one of the things I see is that as people get older, they start to reckon with their life and their life's, pluses and minuses. So, and they may become more spiritual again. Give me an idea, if you have, how can someone reintroduce themselves to, maybe it's their already existing religion, or maybe it's a new religion that may suit them now that they're older? What's a good way to reintroduce themselves?
So may I back up a little bit to just check in definitions? So I think the term spiritual or spirituality is a very broad, expansive term. I just had a conversation with a congregant about that this week, and we have a lot of scientists in my congregation, a lot of physicists, a lot of chemists, and a lot of people who approach spirituality from a sense of interconnectedness. And if we can agree that spirituality is being connected to that which is greater than ourselves, is a good way to start that conversation. How can they re-engage? That's a great question. What comes up for me immediately is that what informs my ministry is service and sacrifice. That is, I have been blessed to be a blessing, which means that I will put myself in places to be of service and to figure out what are the core values for yourself, your loved ones, as a spiritual person, as a person of faith, and to be in community. So my congregation, my denomination, we sort of talk about, you can't be a Unitarian Universalist by yourself, because it is a part of community. That is one of our core values, is that we are interdependent with each other, with nature, with that which is greater than ourselves, that some of us call God, some of us call Goddess, some have the holy unknown. So I would start there. That which is greater than ourselves, which includes memory, which includes legacy, which includes creating a legacy to benefit those who go after us.
So, one of the things also I see, and maybe you see in your congregation, is that the congregation is filled with people, call it 60 and older, but not necessarily filled with people 60 and under. And so any thoughts on how we engage our loved ones who may be younger than us in joining us in a spiritual journey? I didn't say this was going to be easy.
No. I'm looking off to pause and think for a moment. What immediately comes to mind is spiritual practices. And spiritual practices, again, is a very expansive term. And for me, simple spiritual practices like gratitude readings. We make a gratitude list. We have a gratitude jar, my children and I. So if there's something we're grateful for, we'll put it in the jar. When we have a family meal, we have 4 books of graces, and each of the kids picks a grace to say before the meal. So I think spiritual practices as a family is really important. What else? At Thanksgiving, we'll make a gratitude wreath, like everyone creates a leaf, and then every year we add to the gratitudes on the gratitude leaf at Thanksgiving. And being of service, so for around the holidays, one of the things that we'll do is create baskets for interfaith works or manna foods. They'll put out the call of baskets that can be created for families in need. And doing that with children in multi-generational spaces is really important. So yeah, does that answer your question? I think I veered off a little bit.
No, I think you got it. I mean,
Okay.
to me, it's what you're saying is involve people early, and it doesn't have to be you got to go and sit in this building with me. There's lots of ways to be connected without having to go to a physical structure.
Correct.
So, and that sort of leads me to my next question, which is, it used to be we all had to go to a physical structure. Well, and I don't know how your congregation is handling the COVID world, but sort of tell me, how are you all confronting, that people can't come together as community in person as well as they used to? How do you make that happen in a more virtual world?
Whew. We have had to be incredibly innovative, and we did shift pretty quickly to Zoom worship that the same week. So March of 2019, I don't even remember anymore. I have COVID brain, so the edges of my memory are a little fuzzy. So being incredibly innovative in worship, and there's an intimacy in virtual worship that I hadn't experienced. So if I'm on the chancel, if I'm in the pulpit and the congregation is out there, it's a conversation, but it's at a distance. One of the things that I've appreciated about virtual worship is I can see Dan. I know Dan. I know Dan's story. I know Dan's spouse, Barbara. I can see Margie. Margie and I work together. I can see Marianne. These are people that we have a more immediate connection because I'm in a little box looking at all these little boxes. And so one of the principles of my denomination that's really important right now is dismantling internalized and external oppression. Racial justice, social justice, and witness is really important. And for the worship life, we've been able to bring in videos and images of diverse music from around the world and been able to create worship that's more responsive to the moment. And that's been really wonderful too. And we have small groups that meet twice a month. They used to meet once a month in person, but now many of the groups meet twice a month. One's for a check-in, and one's to go through a soul matters. They do a reflection around a common theme. And now we're going to multi-platform, so we've actually built into the sanctuary to support virtual and in-person attendance, which we were open for like 5 months, and now we're coming back to multi-platform on the 27th.
Okay. Are there any, have you seen either in your congregation or your own life experience, any end of life sort of patterns or rituals that people, that you see have worked for people to help them connect and work together as a sort of family with that passing of someone?
It depends on how overt the family is willing to be around this topic. Covertly, it's just asking stories and sharing stories, which is so important. Similar to you, my mother died of pancreatic cancer, not this summer, but last summer. And during COVID, I think there's another layer of grief that we don't have those hours together of, hey, could you tell me the story about your 15th birthday? Could you tell me about your first kiss? Could you tell me about the first time you did X, Y, or Z? And if nothing else, at end of life, sharing those stories gives permission for a deeper connection and gives permission for the person to say harder things. So there are tender stories that emerge, there's heartbreaking stories that emerge, and then there's an opportunity to ask the deeper questions like, so what do you believe? What happens after we die? What do you believe is important to tell or do or say, at the end of your life? So.
And one of the things that I found most interesting, and I don't know what you do in the Unitarian Church, but when my parents passed, we had people come up and speak about things that happened that they knew about my mom or my dad. And I thought that was the best experience. I learned so much about my parents that they never shared with me. Stories I really wished I would have heard. Like it took my father 5 years to graduate college, and he beat us to death to get it done on time. I would have wanted to know what he was doing that made him take an extra year. I don't get that opportunity. But that is one of the things that I think is interesting, is that parents should share these stories with their kids to let them know they're human, they made mistakes, they did interesting things, because I learned a lot of interesting stories about my parents after they were gone, which was great. But I would have loved to have been able to talk to them further and say, so what about that time you drove a car into a lake and it sunk? I mean,
right.
What's that all about? Which was another story I heard about my father's time in college that sort of never made it to my knowledge. So I don't know if the Unitarian Church has anything like that.
Well, so we are known. I've heard of many Unitarian Universalists who came to us through memorial services, actually, because they attended a memorial service at a UU congregation. It's like, this is very different, because one of the things that we do is have an extended period of tributes. So that is one of the things that it's a celebration of life. It's a celebration of that person's legacy. So those stories are such a gift to the family for exactly that reason. Hearing things that your family, your parents may have never thought to share and maybe didn't necessarily want to share, but it shows the fullness of their humanity, through the storytelling. I think that's really important. And I just wanted to note, I saw Patricia shared in the chat, music is so important. In hospice care, at end of life, in grief, in mourning, music can convey and unlock places that are stuck with words. More feelings can be opened and those memories can be accessed through music. And I mean, you're probably very aware that if someone is having memory challenges, music can elicit those memories because it reminds them of a time or a place or a person. So music can be a wonderful tool to really accompany someone in that journey towards their last breath.
So what am I not asking that you want me to ask because you want us to know about during this talk?
Years ago, there's an art museum in Baltimore called the American Visionary Art Museum, AVAM. Is anyone familiar with it? It's one of my favorite places in the world. Thank you. I see nodding heads. Thank you, Tricia. And there is a painting of a skull superimposed over flowers that were dying. And it comes from the school of Memento Mori, which means remember your death. And it's a Buddhist and a monk monastic tradition of meditating on a skull or meditating on the fact that we will die every day. And that took root in me early on. You know, I love my skulls. It's my favorite mug. It says "Live in the moment" on the inside. For me, there's a difference between carpe diem, which is seize the day, which feels whimsical. Remember your death, memento mori, means that every day is precious and every day is an opportunity to create a legacy and to be of service and to remember how broad and great and challenging and heartbreaking the world is and how our gifts are important. So, yeah, I think that's all I have.
Are there any tips or things you've learned that might help people prepare for a loved one's inevitable death? You know, people are in hospice, you know it's coming, and are there ways to prepare yourself for that so that when it happens, you know, you're ready, or as ready as you can be?
I'm not sure if that's possible.
All right.
I would say I think it's an unreasonable expectation to feel like we are ever going to be ready. And there can be the safety net, a container of holding, because no one is truly ready for that moment, I think, on some level. Chaplains are wonderful, ministers are wonderful, anyone to support who is fluent and comfortable in the language of life's transitions and can talk about death in an honest and concrete and direct way. And recently I just read a book called The Book of Two Ways by Jodi Picoult. She's a wonderful fiction writer, but the main character is a death doula. And one of my colleagues, a few of my colleagues, have received training as death doulas. And if you're familiar with the birth doula, that is someone who accompanies people as they're giving birth. A death doula is someone who accompanies people at the end of life. So I think there's more resources and places and spaces to have these conversations. Just make sure to ask for help and to keep talking about it and to be around other people who know what it feels like to lose someone and what it feels like to face that last chapter.
I'm going to do a little shameless plug for Patricia.
Please?
We do something called Death Cafe, or Patricia does it. So if you don't mind unmuting and just give us a minute about that, because I think it's a great program that is super helpful for people.
Thanks, Steve. I did put it in the chat, and I'm actually putting in the chat about a book that's a great story about choosing one's death time, which is a whole nother discussion, I guess. But it is something that is legal in many states in this United States, and there are many hoops to jump through, but it is something for folks to think about as well. So Death Cafe is an international program started in Europe, actually, several years ago. And through Pump House Village, which is the village that I live in Rockville, Maryland, we decided to launch an in-person Death Cafe at a little Argentine restaurant. And it was great because, you know, Steve offered to buy the first round of beers and some appetizers. And then we all talked about death and dying. It was perfect. But then COVID hit and we went on Zoom, and now we are attracting people from all over the world, and it's making for very dynamic discussions. It's not a place to talk really about grief. It's not a place to talk about politics or religion, but spirituality is welcome and practical guides. So we've had several death doulas on the program, hospice nurses. Jane Markley is our go-to for advanced directives. She's often on the program. And we just find that the participants really need this place to just say the word death a few times out loud. That even just saying the word can be so challenging for families. And that's, you know, then we talk about legacy and, you know, hopeful and what's worth living for. For a lot of people, they need to re-identify that.
Great, so thank you. So one more question for you. Of course, it's another difficult one, Rebecca, I apologize, but can you share with us a little bit of the difference between religion and spirituality? Because they're not necessarily the same. Maybe they are.
True. Um, so as you, we dance in the gray. There are no black and whites. That's what I like to say. Religion, the Latin root word of religion is religio, which means to bind. Religion means that we are bound to one another. We are bound to something that is greater than ourselves. As Unitarian Universalists, we talk about covenant, which means that I covenant with you to be a part of this community, to be of service, to be connected, and to participate in the life of the congregation. So for me, religion is bound up with other people, and yeah, being in. I'll leave that there. And spirituality is more individual, but as a minister, my responsibility is to cultivate spiritual practices and a connection with spiritual traditions within worship and within programming and teaching, and to give folks a permission, a space to have permission to explore unanswerable questions. One of the principles of Unitarian Universalism is the ongoing search for truth and meaning. It's a lifelong search. We don't tell people the capital T truth. We hold truth with loose fingers, is what I say. And part of the spiritual path is to continue to ask those questions and to come to your own sense of what is right and appropriate in your answers yourself.
Okay, great. So one last question that I have. Any thoughts on sort of spirituality and movement?
Spirituality and movement. Actually, Patricia and I were talking about working out. So my day starts very early, as does Patricia's. I start at 5:30 and 6 o'clock in the morning. My spiritual practice is to work out in the morning and to do yoga and to move, because I've been blessed to be a blessing, and that means that I need to take care of my body in order to be of service. But more expansively or more practically, for me, moving mindfully and breathing mindfully is a spiritual practice. One of the songs that we sing is, when I breathe in peace. When I breathe out love. Breathe in, breathe out. And just returning to the breath is a spiritual practice. So that somatic experience of that which is greater than ourselves, the sacred, the divine, the holy, is also experienced within our bodies as well.
Okay, one last question, Patricia, if you'll let me. I realize we'll probably go over time, but I realized I needed to ask it.
You're learning so much, Steve.
Well, so, as a minister, I think this is something you probably have to figure out how to do. How do you hear someone's grief, but not take it in so that it affects you internally? How do you build up that sort of, I don't know if it's a shield or whatever, that you can hear the grief, but not absorb it and impact your life?
One of the things that we talk about as religious professionals, military chaplains, is not visceral grief, not vicarious grief or vicarious trauma. And that self-differentiation, I understand that I am a vessel. I am a vessel to receive that grief, to receive the pain, to hold that, but it's not mine. It's not mine. And so I can leave the space. One of my chaplain colleagues, who's also a hospice chaplain, he's very mindful that he'll wash his hands at the end of each visit. And for him, that is washing his hands and just putting it down, and so he can move on to the next person or the next experience. And being very accountable to my colleagues. So I'm in spaces, collegial support groups, peer support groups. I have a counselor. I work out every day. Like there's ways, so it doesn't stay in me. Yes,
Great.
I can hold it and then give it back.
All right, great. Well, thank you. I didn't see any questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone has any questions they want to unmute and ask real quick. We're really sort of out of time, I realize, but I was just fascinated.
You're very kind, Steve. I'm not shy. You can ask me anything.
All
And I
right.
did,
Yeah, go ahead.
no, I was going to say both our phone number and contact information and Rebecca's is here for you. So if you feel like you'd like to follow up, we would love that opportunity to chat with you some more. We're always available to help our families age well. And this is a question that sometimes can keep people from really embracing life if they're worrying about the death side. So please feel free to reach out.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining. Rebecca, thank you. This was super helpful and really informative. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. My wife couldn't be on the call today because she's teaching a yoga class, but she's vowed to listen in because she was really interested in what you had to say as well. So thank you very much. Again, thank you all for attending, and we will see you next month at our next What's Your Plan?
Thank you so much for having me. This is an honor.
Great. Bye-bye.